They said I'd lose the ranch within a month if I hired him. 3 days later, the same people were standing outside my barn asking where they'd gone wrong. Pause. The strange thing wasn't that he saved my ranch. Pause. It was how he knew exactly where to look. The valley had a way of making every season feel permanent. In summer, the grass stretched across the hills like an endless green sea. In winter, the wind swept through the cottonwoods with such determination that even the oldest ranchers stopped talking long enough to listen. By the autumn of 1887, the fields around Dry Creek had turned the color of old brass, and every sunrise carried the promise of another difficult day. For Samuel Whitaker, difficult days had become ordinary. At 44 years old, he had spent more than half his life on the Whitaker Ranch, land his father had cleared with little more than stubbornness, borrowed tools, and a belief that honest work eventually rewarded honest people. Samuel had inherited that belief along with the ranch itself. People throughout the valley respected him for it. He paid his debts. He kept his word. If a neighbor lost cattle in a storm, Samuel helped gather them before tending to his own. If a widow needed firewood, it appeared on her porch before sunset, and nobody ever saw who delivered it. He wasn't a man who spoke often, but when he did, people listened. They assumed a man like Samuel Whitaker had everything under control. They were wrong. Every morning before first light, he walked the north pasture with a notebook folded into his coat pocket. Every evening, he returned with one more number that refused to add up. Another calf gone, another section of fence needing repair, another wagon wheel that somehow disappeared overnight, another account overdue. He never discussed those numbers in town. When people asked how business was, he answered the same way he always had. Can't complain. Then he smiled just enough to end the conversation. The truth was quieter than complaint. The spring rains had come too late. The hay harvest had yielded barely enough to last the winter. 3 cows had died without any clear explanation. Tools vanished from the equipment shed often enough to be troubling, but never enough to prove someone was stealing. Bills arrived with dependable regularity. Money did not. Some nights, long after the lanterns burned low, Samuel sat alone at the kitchen table with ledgers spread before him. The silence inside the house was heavier than the silence outside. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone nearly 5 years. People often said grief became easier with time. Samuel had never argued with them. He simply wondered if they had ever buried the person who made a house feel occupied. The empty chair across the table still faced him every evening. Sometimes he caught himself looking up before remembering no one would be there. Then he returned to the figures. There was always another column to calculate, always another expense to postpone, always another problem waiting for daylight. And yet, when Sunday came, he arrived at church with polished boots and a pressed coat, greeting everyone with the same steady nod he had offered for years. No one needed to know the ranch was beginning to slip through his hands. At least, that was what he believed. The first frost arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected. That same morning, an unfamiliar rider entered Dry Creek. Most people noticed a horse before they noticed a man. The gelding was gray with age, moving carefully, each step measured as though remembering younger legs. The saddle showed years of careful repairs. Nothing matched. Every leather strap had been stitched more than once. The man riding him looked no different. His coat had faded from black to charcoal under countless summers. His boots had been resoled so many times they no longer resembled the pair they once had been. His hat carried the pale ring left by years of sun. He wasn't old. Late 30s, perhaps. But hardship had a way of adding years that calendars never counted. His name, people would later learn, was Elias Boone. He carried everything he owned. 1 saddle, 1 roll bedroll, a canvas bag scarcely large enough for a change of clothes. Nothing else. By evening, someone noticed him making camp behind the abandoned train depot, where freight crates gathered dust and weeds pushed between the tracks. He asked no one for charity. He bothered no one. He simply fed his horse before feeding himself. That alone became the first subject of conversation. Must care more about the animal than himself. Or maybe it's the only thing he's got left. Nobody knew. By the following afternoon, everyone seemed to know something. He came through Sheridan last year. I heard he lost 3 jobs. My cousin swears he caught him sleeping inside a stable. They say he drinks. They say he steals. They say he's trouble. In a town the size of Dry Creek, rumors travel faster than freight trains. Facts rarely caught them. No one seemed particularly interested in discovering which was which. Samuel first heard about Elias while buying horseshoes at Miller's General Store. The store always smelled of coffee, leather, flour, and fresh-cut pine. Conversations drifted from one shelf to another without anyone raising their voice. His oldest friend, Nathan Briggs, stood near the stove warming his hands despite the mild weather. Nathan watched Samuel count out payment before speaking. "You heard about the drifter?" Samuel looked up. "I've heard there's one." Nathan lowered his voice. "Keep him away from your place." Samuel waited. "He drinks." A pause. "So they say he steals." Another pause. "So they say he never keeps work." Nathan folded his arms. "And if you hire him, he'll disappear with your horses before the week's over." Samuel considered the statement with the same careful attention he gave everything. Then he asked quietly, "Have you met him?" Nathan hesitated. "No." "Have you seen him steal anything?" "No." "You seen him drunk?" "No." Samuel picked up the small sack of horseshoe nails. "I've learned something over the years." Nathan looked at him. "Hungry men usually work harder than proud ones." Nathan sighed. "That's exactly why people take advantage of you." Samuel smiled faintly. "Sometimes." He lifted the sack onto his shoulder. "And sometimes they surprise you." He stepped outside before Nathan could answer. Behind him, the store door closed with a familiar wooden thud. Ahead of him, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the dusty street. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, Samuel found himself walking toward the abandoned depot instead of home. Not because he had decided to hire anyone, only because he preferred seeing a man with his own eyes before believing what everyone else claimed to know. He rounded the corner of the weathered station. The gray horse lifted its head first. Then the man beside it looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke immediately. For one quiet moment, two men measured each other without judgment. Samuel broke the silence. "Can you still ride?" The stranger brushed dust from his hands before answering. "I can still work." The words settled between them. Samuel noticed something curious. It wasn't what Elias had said. It was what he hadn't. He hadn't answered the question. Not directly. Most men would have. This one hadn't. Samuel found himself wondering why. Before he could ask another question, Elias rested a hand against the old horse's neck with surprising gentleness. The gesture didn't match the stories Samuel had heard, nor did the calm intelligence behind the man's eyes. There was education there. Discipline. A careful way of choosing words. None of it fit the picture the town had painted. Samuel nodded once. "If you're looking for work..." Elias looked up. "Be at my ranch tomorrow before sunrise." "I will." No handshake followed. No promises. Just two simple sentences. Yet as Samuel rode home beneath the fading light, he carried an unfamiliar feeling with him. Not confidence. Not doubt. Curiosity. And sometimes curiosity changes a man's life long before he realizes it. That evening, after putting away his horse, Samuel crossed the yard toward the barn when movement near the old windmill caught his attention. Someone stood beneath its weathered frame, working. He walked closer. It was Elias. No one had asked him to come. No one had told him the windmill had been broken for months. Samuel stopped several yards away. He said nothing. Elias didn't notice him. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to interrupt what he was doing. With patient precision, he studied the rusted mechanism. He picked up a loose iron pin from the ground, adjusted one gear, shifted another by hand, used nothing more than leverage, balance, and careful observation. A few moments later, the blades turned. slowly at first, then steadily. The familiar groan of old machinery gave way to the unmistakable sound of water rising through the pipe. Samuel stared. No tools, no instructions, no wasted movement, just quiet competence. The wind carried the steady creak of the repaired blades across the empty pasture. For the first time in many months, the old windmill was working again. Samuel felt something he hadn't expected. The town had described a drifter. What stood before him was something entirely different. He watched a moment longer, without speaking. One thought settled quietly into his mind. This was no ordinary cowboy, and he had the feeling the valley was about to discover just how wrong it had been. Morning came quietly over the Whitaker ranch. The eastern horizon glowed pale gold long before the sun itself appeared, and a thin blanket of mist rested over the low pasture where cattle moved like shadows through the grass. The air carried the sharp scent of frost, damp earth, and cedar smoke drifting from the ranch house chimney. Samuel Whitaker had been awake for nearly an hour. Habit, more than necessity, pulled him from bed before dawn. By the time the coffee had finished brewing, he was already outside fastening his coat against the morning chill. The yard was unusually still. His ranch hands had not yet arrived. Only one figure moved across the property. Elias Boone. Samuel watched from the porch without calling out. The cowboy wasn't working toward any obvious destination. He wasn't repairing anything or gathering livestock. Instead, he wandered slowly across the ranch with the deliberate pace of someone reading a language written into the land itself. He stopped beside an old fence line, ran one rough hand over a weathered cedar post, tilted his head slightly, then continued walking. A few minutes later, he knelt beside the irrigation ditch that carried water from the creek. He studied the current, scooped a handful into his palm, watched how quickly it drifted away. Then he stood and walked on without saying a word. Samuel frowned slightly. Most men looked at a ranch and saw cattle. Elias seemed to be looking at everything else. By mid-morning, they had covered nearly half the property together. Samuel had expected questions. Instead, there was silence, comfortable silence, broken only by practical observations. Elias rested one hand against another fence post. This one won't survive another hard freeze. Samuel looked at it. From where he stood, it appeared perfectly solid. What makes you say that? The ground shifted. Samuel crouched beside the post. Only then did he notice the smallest gap, where frozen soil had lifted around its base. He nodded. I never would have seen that. Elias shrugged. You don't usually have to. They continued walking. Not long afterward, Elias paused again, this time beside a narrow bend where the irrigation channel split toward the south pasture, the waters running slower. Samuel stared at the surface. It always slows here. No. Elias pointed farther upstream. It started slowing before the bend. Samuel followed his gaze. The difference was almost impossible to notice. Almost. Later that afternoon, they discovered a pile of branches collecting beneath a narrow crossing upstream, reducing the flow just enough to leave part of the lower pasture dry. Samuel looked back toward Elias. You notice small things. They stop becoming small if nobody notices them. The words lingered. There was nothing dramatic about the discoveries. No heroic moments. No great revelations. Only one quiet observation after another. A loose hinge on the grain storage building that would soon fail if ignored. Fresh horse tracks crossing the western meadow where no rider should have been. A section of wire repaired recently with a knot no one on Samuel's crew typically used. Each discovery by itself meant very little. Together, they began to suggest something Samuel couldn't yet define. Throughout the day, he found himself watching Elias almost as often as he watched the ranch itself. Not because he distrusted him, because he couldn't quite understand him. Around noon, They stopped beneath an old cottonwood overlooking the creek. Samuel poured coffee from a dented tin pot into 2 enamel cups. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The breeze stirred the yellow leaves overhead. Some drifted lazily into the water below. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "Where'd you learn to notice all this?" Elias considered the question before answering. "You spend enough years outdoors." He looked toward the distant hills. The land started speaking. Samuel smiled faintly. "And most of us forget how to listen." Elias returned the smile, though only for a moment. Conversation ended there. Neither man seemed bothered by it. Silence, Samuel realized, was easier with Elias than with most people. Not empty, simply unforced. The afternoon passed in much the same way. Checking fences, examining grazing fields, watering horses, repairing a broken gate latched together, without either man needing many words. Trust did not arrive all at once. It settled quietly, like evening light across open country. Still, certain things about Elias refused to fit. Late in the afternoon, he paused beside the old windmill he'd repaired the evening before. He examined its gears thoughtfully. "The gear ratio's uneven," he murmured. Samuel looked up. "The what?" "The larger will transfer too much strain." He pointed toward the mechanism. "If you replace this section with iron instead of oak, you'll double its working life." Samuel blinked. Most cowboys didn't discuss mechanical design. Later, while examining one of the younger calves, Elias crouched beside the animal. He gently pressed along its ribs before checking its eyes. "It isn't sickness." Samuel looked surprised. "The feed changed too quickly after the frost." "You can tell that?" "I've seen it before." That evening, dark clouds gathered over the western mountains. Samuel studied the sky. "Looks like rain." Elias shook his head. "No." "What then?" "Hail." He wasn't guessing. He sounded certain. The storm arrived 2 hours later. "Not rain. Hail." Samuel said nothing. Questions began forming in his mind. Engineering, livestock medicine, weather, surveying. Even the way Elias folded his blankets each morning carried the neat precision of military habit. Where had a homeless cowboy learned all of that? Samuel wondered, but he never asked. Not yet. Some stories announced themselves. Others waited until they were ready. The town, however, had already reached its conclusions. Rumors spread faster than facts. At Miller's General Store, conversation stopped whenever Samuel entered. Buyers who had once promised to purchase cattle suddenly postponed their decisions. One longtime customer quietly mentioned he'd heard Samuel was taking unnecessary risks. Another decided to buy elsewhere. 2 ranch hands hinted they might seek work before winter. Nathan Briggs found Samuel outside the feed store one afternoon. "You still keeping that drifter?" Samuel nodded. Nathan sighed. "Folks are talking." "They always are." "This is different." "How?" "They think you're desperate." Samuel looked toward the distant hills. "Maybe I am." Nathan hesitated. "Then don't make it worse." Samuel climbed into his wagon without answering. The word stayed with him all the way home. That evening, while reviewing another disappointing ledger, he caught himself wondering whether everyone else might be right. Maybe hiring Elias had been a mistake. Maybe the ranch couldn't survive another gamble. He stared at the numbers until the lantern burned low. Outside, the wind carried the lonely creak of the old barn doors. Inside, doubt settled quietly into the room. The knock came sometime after midnight. Not loud, just 3 measured taps. Samuel opened his eyes immediately. Another knock. He lit the lamp and opened the front door. Elias stood outside. His hat was already on, his coat buttoned against the cold. "There isn't much time," he said calmly. Samuel was fully awake at once. "What happened?" "The north pasture gate." They ran. Moonlight washed the valley in silver as they crossed the frozen ground. Long before they reached the pasture, Samuel heard it, the restless movement of cattle. Too many, too close together. His heart sank. The main gate stood open. Half the herd was already drifting toward the narrow ravines beyond the ridge, where frightened cattle could fall in darkness before anyone reached them. No words were needed. Samuel swung wide to cut off the leaders. Elias circled from the opposite side, guiding the animals with quiet confidence rather than panic. His horse moved as though understood every command before it was given. Slowly, patiently, the scattered herd turned. One by one, they drifted back towards safer ground. Nearly an hour passed before the last frightened steer crossed through the repair gate. The valley finally grew quiet again. Samuel leaned against the fence, breathing hard. If we'd been 10 minutes later, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They both knew. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of livestock could have disappeared into those ravines before sunrise. Neither man spoke for several moments. Then Elias slowly walked toward the open gate. He crouched. His lantern illuminated the damp earth. He brushed aside loose gravel with 2 fingers. Samuel stepped closer. "What is it?" Elias studied the ground without answering. There, pressed clearly into the soft soil, a fresh boot print. Not Samuel's, not any of his ranch hands. The heel carried an unusual notch. The toe pointed toward town. Elias rose slowly. His expression remained calm, but something behind his eyes had changed. He looked once toward the distant lights flickering across Dry Creek. Then he spoke so quietly Samuel almost didn't hear him. This wasn't an accident. The wind whispered across the empty pasture, and somewhere beyond the darkness, someone already knew they had failed. The night after the cattle were turned back in the ravine, neither Samuel Whitaker nor Elias Boone slept much. The ranch had grown quiet again. The frightened herd had settled into the north pasture. The lanterns had been extinguished one by one, and the wind carried little more than the dry rustle of autumn grass across the hills. But silence did not mean peace. It meant someone had tried something and failed. Samuel sat on the porch just before sunrise, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. His eyes wandered toward the distant fence line where moonlight had revealed the open gate only hours earlier. Footsteps creaked across the wooden board behind him. Elias stepped onto the porch without speaking. He accepted the second cup Samuel silently offered. For a long moment, they simply watched the valley wake. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the cottonwoods. Somewhere beyond the barn, a rooster announced the morning. Finally, Samuel spoke. "I keep thinking about that gate." Elias nodded once. "So do I? You really believe someone opened it?" "I don't believe." He looked toward the pasture. "I noticed." That answer stayed with Samuel longer than he expected. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply certain, and certainty carried weight. Over the next 2 days, Elias stopped looking for obvious problems. Instead, he began looking for patterns. He never announced what he was doing, never gathered everyone together, never declared that something sinister was happening. He simply walked, the same deliberate pace, the same patient attention, the same habit of kneeling beside ordinary things most people stepped over without seeing. Samuel followed whenever work allowed, not because Elias requested company, because he had begun trusting the man's eyes more than his own. Near the western hay barn, Elias crouched beside the storage doors. The heavy iron lock showed scratches around its edges. Samuel frowned. "I changed that lock in the spring." Elias ran his thumb across the metal. "It wasn't forced." "No, it was opened." Samuel looked again. "How can you tell?" "The scratches aren't around the latch." He pointed lower. "They're around the keyhole." Samuel felt an uncomfortable chill. Someone hadn't broken in. Someone had unlocked it. An hour later, they reached the grain shed. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. The sacks were stacked neatly. The floor had been swept. The inventory seemed correct. Elias lifted one sack, then another, then another. Finally, he set one down. "This weighs less." Samuel stared. "You can tell by lifting it?" Elias gave the smallest shrug. "I've lifted grain most of my life." They opened the sack. It had been mixed with damp chaff, enough to stretch the feed, enough to weaken the cattle over time, not enough for anyone to notice immediately. Samuel's jaw tightened. Someone's been taking it and replacing what they take. That afternoon, they followed the irrigation ditch farther than Samuel had walked it in months. The water looked ordinary, until Elias stopped. He stepped into the shallow current, bent down, ran both hands beneath the surface. When he stood again, his sleeves were wet. He pointed toward the bank. The channel was widened recently. Samuel looked carefully. The fresh cuts were almost invisible beneath the grass. Why would someone do that? So less water reaches your lower fields. Samuel followed the ditch another 100 yards. The answer became painfully obvious. A portion of the flow had been redirected toward neighboring land, not enough to attract attention, just enough to reduce his harvest year after year. He looked back at Elias. This has been happening for a while. Elias nodded. Months, perhaps longer. By evening, they filled nearly 3 pages of Samuel's notebook. Broken locks, missing feed, fresh boot marks, fence repairs made with unfamiliar wire, water redirected, equipment disappearing without force. Individually, each problem could have been explained away. Together, they painted a different picture. Not bad luck, not carelessness. Someone had been quietly bleeding the ranch dry. Samuel closed the notebook slowly. I blame myself for every one of these. You weren't supposed to see them together. Elias's voice remained calm. That's how this kind of thing works. They sat beside the barn as dusk settled over the valley. The horses shifted lazily inside their stalls. A lantern burned between them. Its warm glow reached only a few feet before giving way to darkness. Samuel turned another page of the notebook, then closed it again. He looked toward Elias. There's something I don't understand. Elias waited. You notice things other men don't. Silence. You understand machinery. Another pause. You know livestock better than most veterinarians. Samuel's voice softened. You read land like a surveyor. Still Elias said nothing. Samuel studied him carefully. How? The question hung in the cool evening air, long enough that Samuel almost apologized for asking. Instead, Elias stared into the lantern flame. When he finally spoke, his voice carried neither pride nor self-pity, only memory. I built ranches. Another pause, before I lost mine. The words settled quietly between them. Samuel didn't interrupt. Some stories deserved room to breathe. It wasn't always like this. Elias continued. There was a time when people knew my name for different reasons. His eyes remained fixed on a lantern. I owned land farther west. How much? A little over 12,000 acres. Samuel looked up. That wasn't merely a ranch. That was an empire. There were 400 head of cattle, 2 barns, a blacksmith shop, a schoolhouse my wife convinced me to help build. A faint smile crossed his face. It always smelled like fresh bread because she'd bake for the children every Friday. For the first time since Samuel had met him, Elias looked somewhere else entirely. Somewhere years away. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life there. The smile disappeared. I trusted the wrong man. His business partner had handled contracts while Elias managed a ranch. The books, the purchases, the legal papers, everything requiring signatures. One signature became another. Then another. Loans appeared. Land changed ownership. By the time Elias understood what happened, the ranch belonged to someone else. Legally, completely. I fought it. I lost. Winter arrived before spring could repair anything. Money disappeared. Credit vanished. His wife became ill. There wasn't enough to pay for the doctor. She died before the first thaw. Their young son survived only a few months longer. Elias stopped speaking. The silence that followed carried more weight than the story itself. Samuel lowered his eyes. No words felt large enough. Finally, he asked quietly, "And after that?" "I kept writing." "Why?" "Because staying hurt more." He looked toward the darkness beyond the barn. "I stopped believing any place could become home again." Samuel remained silent for several moments. He looked at the worn saddle resting nearby, the patched coat, the weathered boots, the gray horse sleeping in its stall. None of them seemed poor anymore. They seemed surviving. Finally, Samuel spoke. "You never stopped being a cowboy." Elias smiled sadly. "No." He looked across the moonlit pasture. "I just stopped having a ranch." The next morning, everything became clear. Nathan Briggs arrived carrying papers he'd found at the county office. Land offers, purchase requests, property surveys. Every document traced back to the same name, Harold Mercer, owner of the neighboring ranch, one of the wealthiest men in the valley. For nearly a year, Mercer had been quietly offering to buy Samuel's land, every offer lower than the last, every refusal followed by another unexplained setback: the dying cattle, the damaged fences, the missing supplies, the failing harvest. Samuel spread every paper across the kitchen table. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. He wanted the price low. Elias nodded, so he made sure it kept falling. That evening they made a plan. Not a complicated one, a patient one. They repaired nothing, changed nothing. Instead, they waited. Just after midnight, movement appeared near the north pasture. Two riders slipped through darkness. One carried tools. The other led spare horses. They worked quickly, confidently, like men who had done this before. They never saw Elias waiting in the trees. By the time they reached the gate, Samuel stepped from the shadows. The riders turned. Too late. Sheriff Caleb Morris and two deputies rode in from the eastern ridge. The escape ended before it began. One saddlebag held forged deeds. Another carried Whitaker branding iron stolen months earlier. The evidence was overwhelming. By sunrise, Harold Mercer's entire scheme had begun to unravel. Witnesses came forward. Workers confessed. Records surfaced. Within days, the county court froze Mercer's claims against neighboring properties. For the first time in months, the Whitaker ranch belonged only to the Whitakers again. Samuel stood beside the repaired north gate as the morning sun climbed over the valley. 3 days earlier, he had hired a man everyone else dismissed. 3 days later, his ranch still stood. His cattle still grazed. His future no longer looked measured in weeks. He looked toward Elias, who was quietly repairing a section of fence as though none of it had been extraordinary. Samuel smiled to himself. Some men save a ranch with money. Some save it with strength. And once in a lifetime, a man saves it simply because he never forgot how to pay attention. The first snowfall arrived quietly. It covered the wheel ruts leading into Dry Creek, softened the sharp edges of split-rail fences, and settled across the Whitaker ranch with the calm certainty that only winter could bring. The valley looked unchanged from a distance. Up close, everything was different. The broken gate on the north pasture had been rebuilt. Fresh cedar posts stood where the damaged ones had leaned. The irrigation ditch carried a steady current again, its banks carefully restored before the ground froze solid. The cattle, once restless and underfed, moved through the pasture with the slow confidence of healthy animals. For the first time in nearly a year, Samuel Whitaker walked his land without carrying the weight of another unseen problem on his shoulders. News traveled quickly through small towns. The truth traveled more slowly, but eventually it arrived. The story of Harold Mercer's sabotage spread from ranch to ranch, then from the general store to the church steps, until there was no one left who doubted what had happened. The evidence had been too clear. The sheriff's investigation had uncovered forged records, stolen supplies, and years of quiet manipulation meant to force Samuel into selling the ranch for a fraction of its value. And alongside that story came another. The drifter everyone had warned against had been the one to notice what no one else had seen. The same people who had shaken their heads when Samuel hired him now removed their hats when Elias Boone passed by. Some apologized. Others simply pretended they had never doubted him at all. Elias accepted neither apology nor praise with much enthusiasm. He thanked people politely, then returned to work. One afternoon, old Nathan Briggs rode to the front gate, carrying a sack of apples from his orchard. He found Elias repairing a wagon wheel beside the barn. Nathan cleared his throat. "I owe you something." Elias looked up. "You don't. I judged you before I knew you." Elias rested the hammer across his knee. "A lot of people did." Nathan nodded. "I was one of them." For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Nathan extended the sack. "Take these, anyway." Elias smiled faintly and accepted it. "Thank you." Nathan hesitated before climbing back onto his horse. "My brother's ranch could use a man like you. I appreciate that." "He'd pay well. I'm sure he would. And if you wanted your own place again." Nathan glanced toward the open valley. "There's land coming up for sale south of the river." Elias listened quietly, then shook his head. "I'm grateful, but I'm not looking." Nathan searched his face, as though trying to understand the answer. After a moment, he tipped his hat and rode away. He wasn't the last. Over the following weeks, other offers came. One rancher promised higher wages. Another offered partnership. A banker from the next county mentioned favorable terms on a parcel of land. Each proposal was generous. Each one Elias declined with the same quiet courtesy. Samuel noticed. He never asked why. At least, not immediately. Some questions earned better answers if left alone for a while. Winter settled deeper over the valley. The work changed with the season. Fence repairs gave way to chopping firewood. Long rides across open pasture became shorter trips through snow-covered trails. Evenings grew longer. The ranch house, once painfully quiet, gradually filled with conversation. Not many words. Just enough. Samuel and Elias developed an easy rhythm that needed little explanation. Coffee before sunrise. Checking the livestock together. Sharing meals after dark. Talking only when there was something worth saying. One evening, as snow drifted gently outside the kitchen window, Samuel looked across the table. "You know," Elias looked up from the ledger they had been reviewing. "You've been here longer than you planned." Elias considered that. "I suppose I have." And what?" "Thinking of moving on?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he folded the ledger closed. "I've gotten used to leaving." Samuel nodded slowly. "So have I." The conversation ended there, yet the words lingered in the room long after the fire burned low. A few mornings later, Samuel walked toward the stable before sunrise. He stopped. Elias's horse stood fully saddled. The bedroll had been tied behind the seat. The small canvas bag rested exactly where it had the day Elias first arrived. Nothing more, nothing less. Samuel approached without hurry. "So," Elias turned. "So, you're leaving?" Elias rested a hand on the horse's neck. "I've gotten used to leaving." He said it without bitterness, almost as though it had become a habit too old to question. Samuel reached inside his coat. He removed a folded envelope sealed with a single piece of wax. He held it out. Elias looked at it, but didn't take it. "What's that?" "The deed." Elias frowned. "To what?" Samuel smiled. "The bunkhouse." For the first time in weeks, Elias looked genuinely confused. Samuel placed the envelope in his hands. "It isn't much. It's old. It leaks during spring storms. The chimney needs rebuilding." He shrugged lightly. "But it's yours." Elias stared at the folded papers without opening them. The stable fell completely silent. Even the horses seemed still. Finally he looked up. "I don't understand." Samuel's voice remained calm. "A while back." He paused. "You told me you stopped having a ranch." Elias lowered his eyes. "I did." Samuel nodded. "I never said you couldn't have one again." Neither man spoke. The wind stirred loose snow outside the stable doors. Some moments asked for speeches. This one didn't. Elias carefully unfolded the document. His eyes moved across the page once. Then again, His hands trembled almost imperceptibly, not from the cold. He looked toward the bunkhouse standing beyond the corral. It wasn't grand, just a sturdy little building with a stone chimney, a wide porch, and a view across the pasture toward the hills. For years it had housed hired hands who stayed one season before moving on. Now it waited for someone who had spent too many years believing he could never stop moving. Elias folded the deed again with extraordinary care. His voice came quietly. "I don't know what to say." Samuel smiled. "You don't have to." Another long silence settled between them. This one felt different. Not empty. Complete. Winter passed. Spring returned. The creek swelled with snowmelt. Green pushed through the hillsides once again. Calves filled the lower pasture. The repaired windmill turned steadily above the well. Business returned to the Whitaker ranch stronger than it had been in years. Neighbors who once avoided the place now sought Samuel's advice. More importantly, the people working the ranch naturally began looking toward one man whenever difficult decisions arose. Not because anyone had appointed him, because experience quietly earns authority. Someone would ask, "What does Boone think?" Another would answer, "Let's wait until he gets back." Before long, everyone simply assumed Elias was the foreman. Samuel never announced it. Elias never requested it. The position found him on its own. Perhaps that was the only kind worth having. Months after his arrival, Samuel overheard two boys talking outside the general store. "Is that him?" "The one who saved the Whitaker place." The older boy nodded. "That's Mr. Boone." Samuel smiled to himself. Not the drifter. Not the homeless cowboy. Mr. Boone. Respect had replaced rumor. Not because people had finally learned his story. Because they had finally watched his character. On a warm evening near the end of spring, Samuel stood beside the old windmill as it turned steadily against the western sky. Elias walked across the yard, carrying a toolbox toward the barn. The sight made Samuel think about the morning they had first met behind the abandoned depot. One horse, one bedroll, a man carrying everything he owned. 3 days had been enough to save a ranch. It had taken a little longer to rebuild a life. Looking back, Samuel realized the greatest gamble had never been hiring a stranger. It had been choosing to see possibility where everyone else saw failure. People often believe they understand someone by the chapter in which they first meet them. But no life is contained in a single chapter. Some are stories of loss. Some are stories of endurance. And once in a while, if someone is willing to offer trust before certainty, the next chapter becomes the one that changes everything. The Whitaker ranch survived because one man refused to judge another by rumor. Elias Boone stayed because one man offered him something greater than wages. He offered him a place to belong. Sometimes that is the rarest gift another human being can receive. And sometimes it is enough to change 2 lives instead of one.